Hello and welcome to this Android Adventure tutorial brought to you by North Border Software. My name is Gary and this is part 2 of the Working with Google Maps series. What we're going to do here is just simply look at enabling the My Location layer within the map. So the My Location layer is just a simple way of pinpointing your own location on a map, and that's the icon associated with that layer is normally signified by a circle with some crosshairs in the middle. So prior to API 23, that was a really straightforward task. It was just a single line of code that was needed. But since API 23, we now have to use runtime permissions as well, or grant runtime permissions as well for that line of code. That's really because that line of code requires the user's location to pinpoint itself. And that is classed as a dangerous permission in Android terms. A dangerous permission is any permission which can access the user's private data. So we'll start by actually entering the line of code into the onMapReady callback method. So it's just simply mmap, and it'll be set location enabled equal to true. And what you can see it's actually complaining because it actually wants those runtime permissions to be granted. So we can just add the code automatically with this permission check. Now what you can see here, the area is cleared and it's just added this section of code here. We'll just take a little look at actually what's going on here. Basically what it's saying is if the application has not granted permissions for the find location and the course location, then we need to do something here to get the user to grant that permission. So normally that's done in terms of a dialog box which we can call up. There's a couple of things here. We're working with this negative logic here, so we're saying if the permission for the find location has not been granted and the permission for the course location has not been granted, then we'll do the work. And we're not actually working with a course location, and also I don't particularly want to work with this negative logic. I rather do a check to see that if the permissions have been granted, we'll just carry on with the enabling the location layer. Else, if they're not being granted, then we'll call up the dialog box to deal with the permissions in runtime. So let's just change this logic here. So let's just change this to equivalent to. Let's just take out the section associated with the course location because we're not dealing with that at all. And this just simplifies things. Okay, so now we're just quite straightforward. It's quite straightforward. We're just going to say if the permissions for the find location have been granted, then what we need to do is actually set the location layer. So I'm just going to cut this, and we're just going to enable this location layer to be true. We don't need this return statement. So else, the else situation will be when we have not granted permissions. Now what we can do here is actually call up a dialog box. But before I put that command in, I just want to define an integer value. The purpose of this integer will be clearer later on. So just go to the top here. It'll be private, and it'll be final static, and I'm going to call it it'll be an integer, and I'll call it my, and it'll be permissions find location. I'm going to set it to a nominal value of 101. Okay, so don't worry about that at the moment. It'll become clear why we've done that soon. So what I'm going to do is just type in the dialog box with the request permissions method. Okay, so this is the line of code which calls up the dialog box to request permissions in runtime. So request permissions is the method, and what we're asking for in terms of these parameters is we're going to ask permission for the find location, and on the user response we're going to pass the integer value defined by my permissions find location, which is set to 101. We're going to pass that to a callback method. The use of that will become apparent later on. You can see there's still an error here. Now this code was introduced in API 23 or higher, so we're going to need to surround this with some code to just check to see which API version the user is running on their Android device. So we can actually do this automatically, and this will just take care of that particular problem. So it's worth just a recap of what we've actually done here. So if the permissions for the find location have been granted, then we'll simply enable the my location layer. If they've not been granted, then we'll prompt the user to allow or deny those permissions in runtime with this set line of code here. So when they've actually enter the response to that dialog box, there's a callback method called, and this is on request permissions result. So we need to handle that case where we allow or deny the permissions. Okay, so I'll just come outside of the onMapReady callback method, and I'll just do Control O, and I'm looking for on request permissions result. Okay, so you can see it's just entered quite a lot of code in there automatically. Okay, so you can see there's quite a few parameters here, so let's just have a quick look at what's going on. So really all we're passing is the request code, which happens to be that particular integer which we defined, in our case 101. We need that because we might be dealing with multiple permissions in an application, so we want to define a request code for each particular permission, and every time this on request permission result callback method is executed, we can just check to see which permission we're dealing with, and then address that appropriately with specific code for each permission. We also pass the actual permissions themselves and the result of the dialog box, which is either allow or deny. So we're just going to focus on the grant results and the request code here. So the first thing I want to do is set up a switching case. So we'll just switch, and we're going to switch request code. So what I want to do is just set up a case for our particular request code, which is 101, or my permissions find location. So it'll be case my permissions find location, and I'll do a break there. Okay, so inside here we need to just put an if statement. So if the permissions are granted, we're going to do something, and if the permissions were denied, then basically we're going to put up a message and quit the app. So first of all, we need to put an if statement in here. So this if statement is quite straightforward. It's if the results were granted, then we're going to do something. If it's denied, then we'll do something down here. So first of all, if it's granted, we actually just want to set the my location enabled to true again. The reason we need to do this, what you have to appreciate is that when we show a dialog box in Android, it's kind of a synchronous activity. It shows the dialog box, and the application will just continue to run in the background. So the first time we actually run the app, the permissions would not have been granted. So in this case, the if this part of the if statement would not have been executed, and we'll just drop to the else, and this set my location enabled true would never have been executed. So once that permission is granted, we then need to call this particular command again. So this is what I'm going to do. I'm just going to copy this statement again and just drop it in here. And you can see what it's going to do now is just call for another permissions check. So This is just something we need to handle. So we'll just surround this with a permissions check. And actually, to make this straightforward, we just need to really just kind of replicate what's going on here. So we don't really want the course permission. Okay, and we'll just take this bit here, cut it in there, drop it in there. We'll just get rid of this comment field. So that's the case taken care of for when we've granted the permissions. We're just going to do a permissions check, final permissions check, and set my location enable to true again. So we just need to handle the situation where the user denies permissions, and all we're going to do is just show a message and then quit the app in this particular circumstance. So I'm just going to do this with the toast. So it'd be toast.makeText, and we'll just get the application context, and the message will be something like this app requires location permissions to be granted. So this app requires location permissions to be granted, and it'll be toast dot length long, and we'll just finish it off with dot show. Okay, and the other thing we need to do is just finish the app. Finish. Okay. Really, all we wanted to do was actually enter one line of code to enable the location layer, and this was the code here. But because this requires the location of the phone, which is a dangerous permission, from API 23 or higher, we need to do a permissions check. So basically, we just said if the permissions have been granted, then we'll run the command. If not, then we'll prompt the user to allow or deny the permissions. On the response to that dialog box, this callback method is executed, and what we said is the request code, which we defined as 101, we'll just check it against the switching case here, and if the permission's been granted, then we'll just set my location enable to true again, just make sure that's executed. If not, if they're denied the permissions, then we'll simply show a message and quit the app. So all we need to do is actually just give this a test now on the emulator, and we'll just start it up. And you see this is the dialog box, which is requesting the permissions to be granted or denied. First of all, I'm just going to deny them, and you can see we've got the toast message here, and it's quit out. So this time, I'm just going to load up the app again and just allow the permissions. And now you can see that the my location layer has been enabled. What I'm going to do is just seed the emulator with a location. Press this button. You can see it's not actually going to the location. Now this is a behavior that is evident in the emulator itself. If you tested this app now on a real device, it will go to that location, no problem. So what I need to do is just actually quit the app and then load it again, and then all I need to do is go to the location, and now you can see it's actually moving to the actual location itself. We will address that behavior a little bit later on when we look at the fused location provider API. That seems to get around this particular issue, but I'm happy just to live with this for now. What we'll do in the next tutorial is look at these zoom controls and get those working. So I'll catch you in part 3. Bye for now. Remember to like, share and subscribe if you found this tutorial set useful, and all the source code and project files are available for download from my website. Thank you.